Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 10. Today we'll be discussing synthesizing different perspectives. Before we begin, take a moment to gather the materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need a document to write on and access to at least two solutions that you're thinking about including in your Project 2 draft. Now, I will say that Core Lecture 10, as we discuss what synthesis means and how we can synthesize different texts, really what we're getting at today is at the core of what I'm asking you to do for Project 2, the solution synthesis. So really take today's lecture assignment as an opportunity to generate content that you can incorporate into your rough draft and perhaps even in your final draft as well. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. First, we'll define the term synthesis. Next, we'll examine methods for synthesizing various texts. And finally, we'll explore approaches for entering a conversation. Okay, synthesis. What does this term mean? What does it mean when we synthesize sources? If we synthesize a source in our own voice, like what does that even mean? And what does it ask us to do? At its core, synthesis is identifying and unpacking the relationship between various sources as well as sources in your own thoughts. So, when we think about synthesis, it's essentially putting different voices, different approaches, different perspectives or thoughts into immediate conversation with one another to determine, okay, well, what are they saying? And what does this tell us about the conversation surrounding a topic that we happen to be interested in? Now, what I like about synthesis in academic writing, is that it allows the writer to better situate themselves within the topic's conversation. So when we synthesize texts and we're saying, okay, source A agrees with source B in this respect, it gives us the opportunity to say, okay, well, how would I respond to source A? How would I respond to source B? How would I respond to the conversation that I see developing between them? And it does really give us as writers, as generators of original content and original thoughts, an opportunity to really engage and logically engage with other thoughts and opinions regarding a topic that we're interested in. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a closer look at synthesizing texts. Now, when synthesizing text, there are many things that we can keep an eye out for. Some of the most common things, though, is that you want to ask yourself, okay, where do certain sources agree? Where do certain sources disagree? How do they extend or build upon each other? And are there any other ways that they may dialogue? So, do they question each other? Does one open up sort of the doorway for other perspectives that might emerge? So these are things that you can keep an eye out for when you are putting various solutions in and sources into conversation with one another in Project 2. You could say, okay, well, this solution advocates this solution advocates that, but here's where they agree, or here's how they disagree. So what I would recommend is to, especially for Project 2, is really to look at the type of language that is being introduced in They Say, I Say. The reason I assign They Say, I Say, and a reason that I like it so much is because it does provide those templates that allow you to understand what kind of dialogue is going on about a topic that we're looking into, but also it provides you solid templates to really enter the discussion yourself to say, hey, I too have thoughts on this. Here's how I fit into the overall conversation going on. So if we look at some of the examples here, and we'll dig into greater detail into synthesis here in just a moment, but these are just some examples that we can pull from They Say, I Say in terms of how they use language to synthesize different sources and different ideas. So Dr. Erickson's findings agree. So we're showing a relationship of agreement with those presented in the Department of Education's most recent literacy report. So we're saying, okay, Dr. Erickson agrees with, results found in another source. The theories advocated by Eden Lunsford sharply contrast with those of Ong. So we are saying, okay, Eden Lunsford are one source and Ong is another. The relationship that they have to one another and how we can synthesize that is saying that they disagree or they contrast or they're different. Jones's work extends on Meyer's findings as it accounts for a certain molecular structure that previously went unnoticed due to the limitations of available technology. Okay, so that's not necessarily expressing agreement or disagreement as we saw in the earlier two examples, but it's saying, hey, there was a limitation in earlier research, but this is how people have adapted and responded to that. So in this instance, we're saying the work of Jones was able to build upon that of Myers because there were technological advancements that allowed them to fill the gaps in Myers's research. So you can see here how with synthesis, finding sites of agreement and disagreement are great places to start, but there certainly are other ways that we can sort of define and frame the conversations that are going on among various sources regarding a specific topic. Now let's look at the language that we can use for each specific instance or type of relationship that we see when synthesizing a text. First, we'll look at language for agreement. They say, I say frames language for agreement as agreeing but with a difference. Now, that may seem a little counterintuitive, but what it does is it allows you as the writer, the person who is sort of generating this synthesis and noting the relationship among sources in this larger conversation, it allows you to say, yes, this is where multiple sources agree, but here are perhaps their different ways of approaching it or the different ways that they framed it. So you can still express that agreement, you can still note that disagreement, but you can also have the opportunity to say, these are the different ways that they approached it, and yet they still agree. So that allows us to show how dynamic the topic we're writing on is. And it shows how, even though there are sites of agreement and where multiple sources can say, yeah, we all understand this in this way, or we all reached this finding, we can highlight the specific ways that they approached it and the ways that they understood it to show again how dynamic and how fluid that conversation really is. So first, what we can do is we can utilize language that points out unnoticed evidence. So Mr. Carter's argument is intriguing, and I believe we can further his claim by considering the influence of television on teenagers and young adults. So this might be a good example of you as the writer entering the conversation for Project 2. So maybe as you're going through, maybe you find a solution that's advocated by a specific source and you say, hey, yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think that we can continue this line of thought if we look at it in this respect. So we can see how synthesis in terms of, expressing agreement in this case allows us as writers to enter the discussion ourselves and to situate ourselves within that discussion and that conversation. We can also mention personal experience. Now, this is perhaps where you will start to see some of the differences among your sources, especially with certain topics. So, after my experience working with marine life, I can affirm the researchers' call for greater awareness for the disposal of plastic bottles. So, again, while we're expressing disagreement to say, hey, yeah, no, totally agree with what these researchers are saying, how I arrived to that, though, perhaps might not have been from, reading a ton of articles or from, seeing pictures on the internet. No, I arrived at this conclusion because of my own experience working with marine life. So we can see that there still is that little bit of difference there to again demonstrate how dynamic this conversation is. And the experiences that are informing that conversation, but ultimately we still are expressing agreement. And finally, what we can look at, and this might be more relevant to some than others, depending on the topic that you research and the sources that you ultimately include in projects 3 and 4 later on in the semester. You could translate convoluted text. So text where You can tell the author is really smart and they know their stuff. They perhaps just aren't the best writers, or they didn't hire the best editors. So for example, Burke's theory on identification might seem complex to those outside the field of philosophy. Ultimately, he suggests that a speaker should aim to understand the needs of an audience and align their values with those needs. So, as someone who has read Kenneth Burke's work, yeah, I mean, it is not this simple. It takes him 500 pages to basically say that. And you might come across that in your own research, be if you confront that in project 2, 3, or 4, you might find yourself saying, okay, well, I'm developing an expertise on this topic, but if I'm writing for a public popular audience, I may need to put it in terms that are digestible to them, in terms that they can readily understand and apply to better understanding and accepting my own arguments. Now focus our attention on language for disagreement. Disagreement and expressing disagreement can be difficult, and it does have a negative stigma that's attached to it. But what I'm hoping, especially in the core lectures that follow, is we can see disagreement and difference as something wonderful, as something necessary, as something effective for furthering our understanding on a topic that we perhaps have a shared interest in. So, what we'll focus on today then is sort of concretizing and familiarizing ourselves with terms that we can use to express disagreement. And then in future lectures, as we sort of abstract that concept, we can then better say to ourselves, okay, based off of my understanding of why this disagreement exists and perhaps where this kind of tension comes from or this difference comes from, I can better select what words would be appropriate to synthesize these various solutions, or perhaps how I fit into the equation. So let's now turn our attention to some rhetorical tactics that allow us to express that disagreement. And then, of course, throughout future core lectures, we can circle back to this as we try to apply the abstract in future lectures. So first, it's important when you are discussing disagreement and you're articulating a side of disagreement that you explain why. So why does this disagreement exist? How does it exist? And there are a few ways that we can approach that. So first, offer persuasive reasons as to why you disagree. So in her work, Dr. Grove argues for greater internet censorship, but now that's a word we can use for expressing disagreement. She fails to take in cultural protocols surrounding free speech. So this is saying, yes, this is Dr. Grove's argument. I disagree because she doesn't think about the cultural protocols we have regarding free speech and how that might apply to internet censorship. You can also do this with synthesizing different sources. So if you remove yourself from the conversation entirely, you could say in her work, Dr. Jones argues for greater internet censorship, but as Dr. Johnson argues, she fails to take in cultural protocols surrounding free speech. So we have indicated that there is a site of disagreement by using the word but. However, we've also explained exactly where that site of disagreement exists, and why it exists. It's not just, oh, they disagree with each other for the sake of disagreeing with each other. It's often grounded in very specific reasons, which we want to communicate to our readers. The dumb move is not as common, but it is effective if you come across a perspective that's kind of stating the obvious or is arguing for something that really isn't necessary or realistic. So for example, he argues that American education should receive immediate reevaluation, but innumerable studies in various disciplines have already established that need. So maybe this person is arguing for greater funding, looking at, reevaluation. But if everyone else is already saying that, then maybe it renders this argument that we're responding to kind of moot or unnecessary. So we can see how the dumb move undermines perhaps writers who, again, are stating the obvious or what has already been firmly established by other scholars in the field. Finally, what we can do is we can look at it through the lens of twisting the original response. So, the researchers stressed the need for more control over the national borders given the number of individuals entering the country illegally. I agree that there is a comparative high number of individuals entering the country illegally. However, it only demonstrates the need for immigration reform. So, what's interesting here is that we're saying, yeah, we can agree on the numbers, we're disagreeing on the approach, and we're disagreeing on the way in which we can address this issue that we agree on is an issue in some capacity. So, and we can see how that's kind of twisting the original response there, but still is clearly articulating the site of disagreement and why that disagreement exists and how that disagreement manifests. Let's now blend the two, agreement and disagreement, and the languages for those. Let's blend those together now and look at language for agreement slash disagreement. Now, this is where you are simultaneously saying, yes, I'm on board with this, but no, I'm not. Or, if you're putting sources into conversation more directly with each other, of course, you could phrase it in that way. When we think about this approach, we can see it as answering it in a yes no type setup. Now, with this, I've had some students ask in the past, does this mean that, let's say you're putting source A and source B, you're synthesizing those two, and you find that framing them as agreeing and disagreeing simultaneously is the best way to express their relationship? I've had students ask, does it have to be a clear 50-50 split? Like, does half their argument have to agree and half, disagree? No, absolutely not. What's fascinating with this approach is that we can structure the synthesis in a way that favors either agreement or disagreement, depending on what we observe going on among the sources. So, for example, if we look at it, as favoring agreement, we could perhaps write something like, though the governor's views on commercial land development may be controversial, I agree with her focus on bringing more business to the state. So perhaps this writer is saying, yeah, I'm not 100% on board with the environmental impacts this will have, but at the end of the day, I support more business coming to the state. I more generously support that perspective. We can also look at it in terms of disagreement or favoring disagreement. Dr. Banks offers a strong argument for consuming only organic foods. However, I cannot accept his evidence dismissing foods treated with pesticides. So we're saying, yes, this is a strong argument. I can say that eating organic is going to be a good option. But at the end of the day, I'm just not sold on the critiques that they're offering regarding pesticides. So we can see that even if there are instances in which we're noticing both agreement and disagreement, there are ways that we can communicate that relationship. Now the on the one hand, on the other hand type setup is where we perhaps do have that more 50-50 split. So I have mixed feelings on Ms. Gonzalez's claim. I support her idea that parents should have time off with newborn children through the avenues of maternity and paternity leave. However, I do not believe it's the government's job to mandate this leave. So we can kind of see how there is more of a 50-50 split where it's like, yes, I agree with the overall argument, but no, I don't agree with the methods. Or yes, I agree with the methods, but perhaps not the overall argument. And so because those are both very significant chunks of often what sources are producing, the on the one hand, on the other hand approach might be more appropriate than say, hey, I'm going to favor agreement over disagreement or vice versa when trying to emphasize the simultaneous nature of agreement and disagreement among sources. Okay, now let's talk about the lecture assignment. What I would like you to do is identify two solutions to the problem you're exploring for project 2. On your document, I want you to identify instances in which any of the solutions agree, disagree, or agree, disagree simultaneously. But what I also want you to do that's going to be important in your synthesis is that for each instance, I want you to discuss the significance the synthesis has on understanding the topic or problem you're exploring. So let's look at it this way. So let's go back to this example. So in her work, Dr. Grove argues for greater internet censorship, but she fails to take in cultural protocols surrounding free speech. So that is us clearly expressing disagreement, why the disagreement exists and how. But we also want to go a little further to say, okay, well, why does this matter? So maybe we find ourselves saying, this indicates that internet censorship is a conversation that is embedded within the particular culture that it resides in. So, for example, how Americans perceive internet censorship might be different from Canadians and might be different from Mexicans, and so on and so forth. So, the significance is that internet censorship is cultural or culturally situated. So, start thinking about as you go through and you say, hey, these sources agree in this way, or these solutions agree in this way. Cool. What does that tell us about this topic? It shows that everyone's concerned about this particular kind of concept regarding the topic, or if there's a place of disagreement. Okay, well, obviously, maybe people aren't agreeing on how to use certain terms or how to collect data or what should be emphasized with a certain solution. So, what difference does that make, and how does that help us understand the topic or the problem that you're looking at? To help out with this, what I'm going to recommend is to use the templates mentioned in chapter 4 of They Say, I Say. I think using those templates again will help you become familiar with terms that will allow you to clearly express the relationship that you are seeing among the sources and how you yourself fit into that conversation. Right, so for the weekly homework, here's what you will need to do. Make sure that you include your core lecture 10 summary and assignment in your week 5 homework submission. Overall, your week 5 homework should include the summaries and lecture assignments of core lectures 10 and 11, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. Be sure that you upload that to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, February 10th. If you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these concepts further, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas's direct messaging system. All right, everyone, until next time.